We're just going to wait a minute to see. Looks like more people are logging into our Zoom, so hang tight for a moment. We will start in just a moment. Okay, let's begin, and good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Bud Wassell, and I am the moderator for today's session. We're very happy you could join us for this informative presentation on Can I Grow Through Difficult Experiences Like This Pandemic with Dr. Kristine Olson, Chief Wellness Officer at Yale New Haven Hospital, and Kendall Palladino, Director of Pastoral Care at Yale New Haven Hospital. So on behalf of the Smilow Wellness Workshop Committee, we welcome you both, our presenters, and very much looking forward to your talk. And of course, welcome to our audience. We very much appreciate you being here today and hope you are well. Just a quick word or two about Smilow Wellness Workshops. We offer these periodically to patients, their family, volunteers, and staff with the mission of empowering individuals to take control of their own health and wellness. The program features free interactive workshops. We're now on Zoom. We do about 3 or 4 per year that reaffirm the importance of caring for the person as a whole, body, mind, and spirit. Designed to complement traditional lectures and health talks, each workshop focuses on wellness. The committee who plans and conducts these workshops consists of Gisela Boxleitner, Nicole Larissa, Denise Romano, Danielle Segnella, Beverly Block, and myself. And I would also like to recognize and thank Mark Casey from our audiovisual department, who helps us with the technological side. So let us know if you have any suggestions for future topics. We're always looking for good ideas. And remember to complete the evaluations that we're going to give at the end. We really value your feedback. One other housekeeping note, we do ask that you use the question and answer feature throughout the presentation. I will be keeping an eye on that and posing those questions, and there will be an opportunity for you to share a little bit midway through. So let me introduce our speakers. Dr. Kristine Olson, MD and Masters of Science, is a native Minnesotan, graduate of the University of Minnesota Medical School. She's a returned Peace Corps volunteer, experienced in international health in post-conflict zones. In conflict zones, she met her first role models of resilience and began studying the science of thriving and the systems that support it or detract from it. Dr. Kristine Olson came to Yale New Haven Hospital to train in internal medicine and pediatrics, followed by a fellowship in health services research and epidemiology at Weill Cornell Medical College. As a fellow, she studied how health policies and the health system affects professional well-being, and how professional well-being is an indicator of organizational performance in providing reliable access to cost-effective, high-quality, patient-centered care. She is nationally recognized for her work in combating burnout and fostering joy in medicine. Dr. Olson was named Chief Wellness Officer at Yale New Haven Hospital in 2020, and she is committed to creating systems that allow those in it to flourish while in service to others. Kendall Palladino was motivated to enter the field of spiritual care after having worked for St. Teresa in Calcutta, India. Kendall is currently our Director of Spiritual Care or Pastoral Care at Yale New Haven Hospital. He was encouraged by Mother Teresa in 1994 to consider the physical, spiritual, and emotional poverty that exists in the United States before returning to work at a leprosy hospital in southern Thailand. As a result, Kendall enrolled in clinical pastoral education and found a deep and abiding love for the mission of spiritual care. Kendall became interested in post-traumatic growth when he noticed significant growth in outcomes data in grieving adult and children at the Healing Hearts Center in Danbury, Connecticut, between 2000 and 2010. And in order to understand more fully what was happening in these people, he earned a doctorate in 2012 at the Princeton Theological Seminary with a dissertation on the subject of post-traumatic growth and loss. Clients who were impacted by major traumatic events like September 11th and the Sandy Hook school shootings, as well as more specific individual losses from long-term illness, suicide, car accidents, and other causes, were showing dramatic and unexpected growth in their lives. He is currently the Director of Spiritual Care for YNHH Hospital, as I mentioned, and a board-certified chaplain educator. So I think you'll agree, we couldn't find anyone more qualified than Kendall, Chaplain Palladino, and Dr. Kristine Olson. I think of them as our special Ks, and we're very, very lucky to have them here at Yale New Haven Hospital. And just on a side note, as a person would say, I've worked with Dr. Olson and Chaplain Palladino several projects over the course of the pandemic to enhance our employees' well-being. And they are both amazing, caring, energetic, creative, and dedicated professionals. So we're very, very lucky to have them talk to us today. So thank you for joining us. At this point, I will turn it over to Dr. Olson and Chaplain Palladino.
Thank you, Bud. I really appreciate that. Yesterday, the New York Times published an article by Dr. Sunita Puri entitled, "We Must Learn to Look at Grief, Even Though We Want to Run Away." I recommend it to you because we discuss post-traumatic growth through this pandemic, through illness, grief, caregiver hurdles, only embracing our human potential for post-traumatic growth by honest reflection on our real lived experiences with others will suffice. No titles, no education, no experience, no positivity, or any other external factor can help us grow. We gather here together as people facing the human experience of illness, grief, caregiver hurdles, and the COVID-19 pandemic. And first of all, we want you, Dr. Olson and I want you to bring your humanity to this conversation. It's the only thing that will really carry the conversation and the discussion forward. One thing we wanted to do is invite you in the Q&A feature as I continue to open up this dialogue and this discussion, is to write in why you have chosen to join us. People may be coming from different places. So write into the Q&A feature, and Bud Wassell will look at that and he will help guide us. You might put something in the chat like, examples, I face illness and want to understand how I might grow, or I'm exhausted by the pandemic and want to understand what that means. Or I'm grieving my loss of health and normalcy, and I don't know what's going to come next. Those kinds of questions, whatever it is that you bring, put it in the Q&A, and we'll be able to get a sense for where people are coming from. So we are talking about something more than resiliency here. Resiliency is described as bouncing back. While resiliency is important, it is not the subject of our conversation today. What we are talking about is how, by honestly looking at our experience, there is potential for growth. Imagine 3 balls in your mind. First, imagine a basketball. When you bounce a basketball, it bounces right back into your hands. That might be a description of what resiliency is like. When you go down, you come right back up to where you were before. Second, I want you to imagine a bowling ball. When you put a bowling ball down on the floor, it doesn't bounce back. And this may be an example, at least for a time, of post-traumatic stress. We're not talking about post-traumatic stress so much today. What we are talking about is post-traumatic growth. And I want you to imagine in your mind's eye for a moment, one of those rubber bouncy balls, you know, that kids play with, and you take the bouncy ball and you throw it down and it bounces higher up above your head. That is what we are talking about today with post-traumatic growth. We want to understand your motivations. So, please, I hope you've added some of your reasons for being here. And I don't know, Bud, if there's anything in the Q&A that we can share at this point.
Yes, there is, Kendall. We've got a number of excellent sharings here. Just to give you a sampling of some: divorce, chaplains who help patients and families and deal with difficult daily experiences, grief, death, burnout. Tired of being on high alert mode. I need to get back to having hope and living in peace. I can go through all these, but I'm not sure if you wanted to respond, but here's an interesting one. I'm joining due to several traumatic and difficult events over the last couple of years. My own traumatic experience as a patient, with the birth of my daughter, resulting in both of us in ICU stays, during the pandemic, dealing with serious safety events, death as an RN, long life chronic illness. So number of pretty serious traumatic experiences there. The nurse providing care 8 to 10 hours daily, emotionally exhausted, compassion deleted. Loss, a number of loss in the last few years. Like to help staff navigate post-pandemic challenges and life changes and how to make them feel better and not feel these changes as all negative. The pandemic is here to stay, so we better thrive during our journey. A couple more. I know this is a lot, but I want to get this all out there.
Yeah.
I want to be able to help patients and family members who are struggling emotionally. I love the description that says post-traumatic growth versus stress. And then finally, I'm joining after having survived stage 4 tongue cancer, seeking insight on how to recapture myself again. So that's the range of what we've got so far.
Thank you very much, Bud. That's very helpful. Now, Dr. Olson.
Thank you. Could you advance the slide 1, please? Thank you. So we hear from the reasons that we have gathered here today that we've come for many different reasons. The pandemic has opened up, has been a collective type of traumatic experience that we've had together, which opens up the conversation. But you can see from the comments that we are experiencing, the people in our lives, in our community are experiencing very difficult times, traumas of their own throughout the pandemic, before the pandemic, and now that's just added to it that we have the pandemic. And people who may have recovered from previous experiences in their lives that were traumatic for them may have learned things from their experience in the past that they also bring to this space, as we here have this collective wisdom as we come together to think about how do we move through this and what kind of frameworks might help us to move through this more easily. So we did explore this in both that individuals and organizations can use these types of frameworks to grow and learn through this experience. Today, we're going to concentrate on us as individuals collecting here to move through and how we might think about post-traumatic growth. So here we have a healthcare worker holding up the world in this mural. And post-traumatic growth was described by two psychologists, Dr. Tedeschi and Calhoun, and they are people who've observed us as we live our lives and some of the things that people did experience where they were able to not only come back, but to grow through these times. Things that we would not wish upon ourselves or wish upon other people, but through which they have gone through. And we experience post-traumatic growth not despite the troubles and the trials and tribulations in life, but because of them. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we struggle with those trials and tribulations, and it can be our teacher and we can grow. So if we could advance one more slide. So many of you may have seen this as we've talked about the pandemic. You can see where we start pre-disaster at a certain emotional level. And we may have started perhaps stress to begin with, or anyway, it was our status quo. And when something disrupts our life so profoundly that we call it traumatic, and especially with the pandemic and some things we've gone through, especially if it threatens if we've been exposed to or threatened our own life or the lives of others or those we love, those we've experienced, that can really shake us up. And we may at first, our adrenaline kicks in and we rise to the occasion, but then we can sometimes feel when everything is shifted around us that the rug's been pulled out from underneath us and our worldview has been shattered. Maybe it has really affected how we feel about our identity or our security or the way the world works. Somehow we might find ourselves kind of free falling. And we may be down where you see the low parts of the emotional curve there. We may find ourselves there first before we can even think about moving on to anything else or what we might learn from it. And that may be a time of grief. We may be grieving, and the word bereavement means, if you look up in the dictionary, it means to be deprived of or robbed or seized or taken away something that was very dear to you, someone or something that was very dear to you. That sense of your future has been robbed from you as you thought it was going to be. What you thought your life was going to be may have changed. So it's a time where we are coming to terms with that. And it's important to honor that. And there's a term now that people are talking about, toxic positivity. We are not trying to move through something that you first have to honor the loss and the grief that you have. And one thing you want to do while you are honoring that and experiencing that grief is to recognize when you are then moving into adaptive coping, perhaps reaching out of thinking, who can help me through this? Who can support me? Who might understand what I've been through and who can show me some of the ways that they've grown and learned or role modeled? Versus maladaptive coping, where you might find yourself numbing or avoiding or cutting yourself off from people and shutting yourself down. And then as we think about what do we do now with these feelings that we have, as we're ruminating and thinking over what is the world now, as we think about that, we'll move into how that choice of how we think about that can help us move into post-traumatic growth. If we could just go to the next slide here. So when we think about the pandemic, we didn't have any way around it. There was no shortcuts. You couldn't go over it, under it, around it. We had to go through it. There wasn't really any other way to avoid it as a healthcare community. And same with some of the things that we've faced in our lives. We never would have wished it upon ourselves or other people, but we had to move through it. And then this creates a lot of tension and a lot of stress. And then the question is, who's driving? Is the stress driving you, where that kind of searching for that ground again, searching for the answers, where you are looking for, is it driving you to withdraw, to numb, to move away from it, not face it? Or are you driving it? Is it trying to tell you something where it might point you to the answers and point you to the way through? Can it be a teacher if it's not too overwhelming? If it is overwhelming, you might need someone to go through that with you. That's where you're looking for those trust individuals, even a healthcare professional who can help you move through that if it's very overwhelmed to do alone. And then we will go to the construct of what Tedeschi and Calhoun found. So Tedeschi and Calhoun found that some people who were going through traumatic experiences and moving through this stress as they tried to reorder things and try to find a new narrative, trying to find a new way forward, they found some themes that these people were experiencing and that they were open to. One is many of these people who experienced post-traumatic growth had a greater appreciation of life because of what they had gone through. They're experiencing a greater clarity about things. They were open to new possibilities of what the future may hold as they transformed the trials to triumph. And they found that there were deeper relationships that they discovered that they had to rely on people, and people were there for them, or there were people who'd been through things like they'd gone through, and that they were able to find those alliances, that comfort, that support by being open and a bit vulnerable to those they could reach out to. They found that they had a greater sense of strength, that it seemed like something so insurmountable that they were never going to get through it or find a way forward when they were first faced with this. And then they found new and creative ways to be, and they discovered a well of strength within themselves that they didn't know that they had, which was remarkable. And some have experienced a spiritual deepening, not necessarily in the religious sense, but in the sense of a transformational meaning of a deepening of what was clear and true for them, what their values were, and what it meant to be almost transcendent beyond the self and what they were going through. So these were some of the experiences that people who experience post-traumatic growth did demonstrate. Now, it's suggested that maybe if we were aware of these domains, that it would be possible that more people could experience them if we were awake to the possibility. So that's yet to be seen, and we will learn as a community. And I'm going to now turn it over to Chaplain Palladino, who can help us with moving through grief.
Thank you, Dr. Olson. So I'd like to talk a little bit about grief and post-traumatic growth, partly what grief is and what it isn't, and what we're talking about specifically with grief. You know, when we have a loss, whether it's the loss of security, the loss of health, the loss of a loved one, whatever it may be, we have a reaction, and that reaction is holistic. It's not only emotional, but it is that. It's not only spiritual, but it is that. It's social, also financial, physical, mental. It's our complete response to a loss. And grief hits people in waves. It's cyclical more than stage-like. A lot of times the early education on grief was confused and talked about it in terms of stages, as if there was a beginning and an end. But grief is more cyclical and hits us in waves, and we alternate between a sense of reconstruction and loss. So we're feeling more the emptiness of the loss at some times, and other times we're feeling more a sense of reconstruction or change, and it alternates between those two things. Grief is supposed to change and improve, but it may not end. unless we can get back that person or that thing that we've lost. For example, the security of knowing that I'm healthy or having no pandemic at all. Unless we can get those things back altogether, we will continue to have some reaction, some holistic response to the loss. But it does improve and change over time. So it doesn't mean that we're in the midst and throes of active grief and very early grief all the time, but it does continue. Grief is very personal and specific to each of us. The loss and the relationship we had to that thing, to that person who we've lost is going to be very different as any relationship is. So in a family, if somebody loses a father and another sibling loses a father, that loss is going to look different. They're both in the same family and it's both the same person, but the relationship was different, and the loss will be the size of the relationship you have to that person or that thing that you've lost. In grief, most people benefit from feeling cared for, loved, and supported. And in grief, that's a normal, natural human response to loss. And most people do not need therapy or counseling. It's a normal reaction, a human reaction. Some people do benefit from groups and others don't. Only a very small number who grieve require professional therapy. New meaning and purpose and nurturing fond memories of what we lost are important. And there are a very small number of people who get caught in complicated grief where it becomes a pattern that they get caught in and have a hard time getting out of. These results are from my doctoral work and also from a review of the existing literature on grief. So how do we work through grief as a part of post-traumatic growth? For as you saw in Dr. Olson's presentation, that we go through a process when we face a certain traumatic event or circumstances, and our emotions are at high levels and low levels at different points. At some point, though, we have to deal with the reality of the loss. And when we do that, we go through grief. Grief is our normal human response to that loss. And how can we do it in a healthy way? So I've made a mnemonic that relies on my doctoral research. And the mnemonic is this. The first thing to do is I just came back from Belize, where I went with my son. And one thing I'll note, and many people mentioned, one person in particular who's lived there 10 years but was from the United States, is that that country and other countries are less individualistic than the United States. We tend to be very individualistic. We tend to try to want to ace things, to try to do it alone, to try to be the giver and not the receiver. We try to be an ace, when really, if you add an F to the ace, really what we need to do or what's helpful to do is to face the reality of the loss, the real emotions, the real effects, the emotional, spiritual, social, financial, physical, all those things, and to do it in community, not to try to do it alone, but to do it with others. So that's really one of the first things about grief. Is can you do it not trying to do it alone as a sole individual? Can you do it not trying to be the so-called strong one? For in grief, if I can use an analogy of a hurricane, you want in grief not to be the oak tree, which stands tall and strong many times, but in the hurricane gets knocked down. But you want to be the palm tree. For the palm tree bends and moves in the storm. And with grief, we need to do that as well, because as we said, grief comes in waves. So that's the first thing that you want to do when facing or when moving through grief. Not to do it alone, not to be an ace, but to face the true reality of what you're experiencing. The second thing is a lot of times when we feel emotions that are difficult, we try to avoid them in different ways. Some of those are maladaptive ways. Perhaps by hiding our emotions, by drinking a lot of wine after work or at different times. Sometimes that's okay, but sometimes that can become problematic. So we also try to avoid by binge watching on Netflix or by doing many things that will make us not think about the difficulties that we're experiencing. Again, that can be a way in which we, like an eel, try to slip away from the difficult aspects of grief rather than moving through it. And as Dr. Olson said, with the pandemic, we couldn't do that. With major traumatic experiences, we cannot avoid them. We need to move through them. And it's difficult to see others go through hard experiences. It's difficult to go through hard experiences. And yet we need to not be like the eel, but we need to feel supported. Not that we need to feel every emotion, but that we need to feel supported through the emotions of loss. So whatever that is that supports you to seek it out, whether that is the EFR here, or whether for employees, or whether that's counseling, or whether that is a friend who will listen to you, really listen to you and walk with you, but to feel supported. Then in time, in feeling supported through the loss, as you walk through that loss, there is a relationship-sized hole that comes with loss. So whatever, or holes, depending on the losses that a person experiences. So our loss of security, our loss of health, our loss of many other things. I've divided up what people came here about into 5 categories. People talked about secondary trauma and compassion fatigue, burnout. They talked about high alert mode. They talked about illness, chronic or otherwise. They talked about wanting to help others and talked about grief and rediscovery of self. So those are the 5 general categories that brought people here, whatever they're grieving, whether it's divorce or a loss or a death or whatever. And one of the things that we need to do is really look carefully and reflect carefully on how a loss might have affected us and where there may be a gap or a hole. We don't do this early in grief because it's too early to really do that. You need support early in grief, but in time, you begin to notice that there is a hole, and that is the vacuum in which post-traumatic growth has an opportunity to thrive and to come about in our lives. Because as we rebuild our lives, as one would rebuild a town after a hurricane, nobody wishes that the hurricane would come. But when it does come, sometimes it's rebuilt better, newer, stronger than before. And so there's an opportunity, and that's what we're going to talk about a little bit here, a little bit more, about what those opportunities might be for post-traumatic growth in the midst of grief. And lastly, there's the idea of we are well in grief when we've said farewell to the pain of grief, the bitter pain of grief. And we've been able to say goodbye to what cannot return and what cannot be there any longer. We've adapted to the fact that we may never get out of this pandemic back to the way things were. There's a new normal that we embrace. But really, there's a way in which we need to be with the world or exist in the world that means we are well. So after saying farewell, we want to make sure that we're in a position to be able to give, to be able to receive from others, some autonomy. So if we really relied on the person or the thing, maybe it's health, maybe it's amputation, our leg, whatever it may be that we've lost, to come to a place where we can function without that which we've lost. Also, community. When we are able to not just give or receive, giving puts you in the giving position, receiving puts you in the receiving position. Neither of them are equal positions. Community is a peer-to-peer support. Having community and connection with people, when it's a mutual arrangement, it's not a situation in which you are always the giver or always the receiver. And then lastly, expectation. When we have expectation, again, meaning hope or meaning the ability to expect that something new might occur, those are signs in that mnemonic, giving, receiving, autonomy, community, expectation, that we are well, that grief doesn't end, but we are through the grief as much as we can be, and we've learned its lessons. So that is an example of grief and some of the things that we would want to look for in grieving. So we have a lot of great questions on why people have been here or why people have come. And we have a wonderful opportunity to talk about those a little bit more. But we also have an opportunity to write in the chat some of the questions that are on the top row of what is on the presentation here. These are different aspects of when we're in the filling process of grief. And as Dr. Olson had talked about, in the process of reconstruction, the process of post-traumatic growth, these are the domains that she talked about earlier. Development of deeper relationships, openness to new possibilities, greater sense of strength, stronger sense of spirituality, greater appreciation. So those are some questions that you can answer in the chat as we begin to really look at some of the questions of why you're here. Maybe we can have an opportunity to answer and discuss, Dr. Olson and I. And if you can put in the chat different answers to those questions, how might you have changed this difficulty into a triumph or into a growth? Who have been role models for you? Have you discovered an experience bigger than yourself or new meaning through this? So those types of questions are listed here, if you would add them. And to my colleague, Dr. Olson.
Yes, and I want to thank the people who have been sharing what brought them here. One, you have made yourself vulnerable in willingness to share and have been a role model to other people. And as I read through these, there are things that I identify with or others have identified with. And by just you offering that you are human and you're going through these things yourself, you have comforted someone else who didn't feel like they could put themselves out there. And now, because you have shared, you have made someone else feel more normal and less alone. And then you've brought us together as a community, and you've been a role model, and already you are contributing to the healing of our community and other people. So I want to thank those who were brave to share in this venue and to help us to do this.
So let me just interject quickly. Please use the question and answer format to do that. Chaplain Palladino asked you if you had some answers to some of those questions that you see there on the top row of that slide. There was a question that I wanted to pose to you both. Chaplain Palladino, I think you were talking about grief and that many times people do not require therapy for certain grief kinds of events. But there was a question that said, are we meant to think we are not normal if we do require therapy for grief? So yeah, so I thought you might address that a little bit, because I was hearing you say that there's lots of different ways that we can get support from lots of different people and build our support systems. Therapy may be one very helpful one.
Yes. Thank you. I can definitely answer that question. My dad died several years ago, and I reached out to the EFR, and I don't understand myself as being unusual or abnormal in any way. My grief response was normal. And the EFR, which is an employee support system, and not everybody has access to that, but it's therapeutic. And it was a therapist that I went to. Why did I do that? I did that because I was noticing that I was crying a lot. I was getting waves of tears. And I did that because in my line of work as a chaplain, I'm also an educator. And I went to show my students, I was co-leading a group, and I went to show my students how to do a visit. And they were new students and they thought I, did fine and everything. But I looked at the videotape of the actor I was working with, and I said, I avoided that person's grief. And it's because my dad died 2 weeks before. And I wanted to go to therapy because I needed to really look at my own loss so that I could then be with people who were grieving. So yes, grief is absolutely a normal response. And yes, I myself have gone to therapy for grief, and I consider myself to have a normal response to the loss of my dad. So there's nothing but encouragement to utilize therapy. That being said, sometimes people have pathologized grief, and so my comments are meant to normalize grief as a normal human response. And if therapy can be a support to you, as it was to me, then I would encourage you to go. And if you can find support in other ways, that is fine.
And I will double down on that. There is never anything wrong with taking care of your mental health, just as you would any other aspect of your health. If you are curious if it'd be helpful, you should feel comfortable to go and take care of your whole self, including your mental health. Absolutely nothing wrong with tending to your well-being. And your mental health is just as much a part of all of your self and your well-being as anything else.
The part of my comments too are a reaction to a government report. Years ago, there was some grief work done in the 80s in Boston. And it was from that, there was the belief that people, unless they felt certain emotions, anger or sadness after a loss, that they needed to go to therapy. And people were being sort of pressured at that time. I got a government report because I had a bereavement center that I started called Healing Hearts. And that had thousands of people coming to it each year. And a government report came out saying it is now can be problematic if people get the message that there's something wrong with them or that they need to grieve in a particular kind of way. And so the encouragement not to pathologize grief is really coming from that place, but an equal encouragement should be stated that therapy should not be pathologized. It's a wonderful thing. And it's part of community that we all need, and particularly Americans, because we are so individualistic that we need people. And therapy sometimes is the best way to get that.
And there's a couple of comments also in the question and answer supporting that. And so thank you both for clarifying and answering that. Therapy and medication, which I was never keen on, made a huge difference for me. So there's one right there. And this is a great point. I think normal in grief is very subjective. what is normal to me may not be normal to Mary or to someone else. So great point there too. Now there's some great comments here, Dr. Olson and Chaplain Palladino. I'm going to start with this one. You had asked, what are some of the things, some of the answers that you've come up with? And so this one has a number of things. Priority setting to put my family first, much stronger than I thought, but also more vulnerable. That's kind of an interesting observation, right?
Mhm.
To really put family values first, but also makes us a little bit more vulnerable. So any comments about that particular observation?
Yeah, I think being clear about your values sometimes does feel vulnerable, because sometimes it can feel like you think it's up against someone else's values. But I think that's what these things can do. Going through these events can really clarify for us, for ourselves, like what is our best life, what are our values, where do we need to prioritize? And I think that's really important, and that we support one another to live our best lives as a community. It can be very vulnerable to be open. Yep.
Yeah, we kind of feel a little bit like a fish out of water when we do that. It takes a little while getting used to that.
For sure.
Also realigned choices with my values, pushed a job change and returned to school. So how's that for a big positive change, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, good for you.
And I think that also brings up another point of what has this pandemic meant to our country and to us as healthcare and to our community, is that with the great resignation in the country, people are thinking about their priorities and things are becoming clearer to them. And how do we grow as a community, to make this the place for us that we're thriving here? Like what are we being, how has this woken us up as a community to support one another?
Just what we need these days, right?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I had something to say, Bud, about the vulnerability.
Thank you. Please.
When I did my doctoral research, it was on people in Connecticut, and it was a qualitative study. So we did a lot of in-depth diving into people who've experienced post-traumatic, traumatic experiences, particularly grief. And one of the things that came out of that study was the importance of vulnerability, the surprising way in which to be vulnerable actually was indicative of post-traumatic growth more than anything else. So there were a lot of things that could be said about resiliency or other factors, other grief factors, whatever. But with regard to growth, growth tends to occur when we allow ourselves in community, including therapy or including friends or whatever, to be vulnerable. And so my encouragement to everybody here, whether we want to help others more, or we want to get past burnout, or we want to, deal with our own illness, whatever it may be, to rather than run from vulnerability and community, to actually run toward them, but to not do it alone, because you need to find people who will listen to you. And when you help others, being a listener is the best thing you can do. So some of the questions talked about really wanting to be positive and seeing people get hope. The best thing to do is just to listen. And if somebody is struggling, not to give them any answers or try to give them something positive because we're uncomfortable with them feeling or struggling, but to just be an excellent listener, whether it's to be silent or to ask questions or just to walk alongside them. That is the best thing that you can do for anybody going through any of these experiences. And that's the best thing you can do for yourself. So vulnerability, I'm all for it, but it's not easy.
it really validates one's experience to be heard and then understood. And it's such a gift.
Mhm.
Here's another good one with some great suggestions as ways to grow out of this. I feel the pandemic has given me the opportunity to take the very best care of myself like I have never done before. And person goes on to say, I'm connecting to others in deeper ways and have a strong connection to source consciousness. I also feel clarity with living my truth. I'm living my passion and purpose now in my life.
I feel like I need to spend time with that person, maybe just rub off role modeling. Yes.
Yes. Here's a question that I want to pose to both, since we're in our Smilow community, and some people have mentioned going through some very difficult challenges with illnesses and cancer diagnoses and treatment and so forth. I wonder if you could talk to that a little bit in terms of how can we apply some of these concepts to either cancer or a chronic illness, getting through that very difficult stage in our life.
I think one way is to look for role models who've been able to do this. Whatever the struggle, we've heard some of the struggles here, and people have been through different unique struggles, fertility struggles, all sorts of different struggles, is to find someone who've been able to get through it and have shown that ability to navigate it, and see what you can learn from them. That's one way.
Okay, thank you. Would you stop sharing there for a moment? Is that the end of the slides?
That was the, actually there was one other slide now that I think about it.
Okay.
So maybe I should share that.
While you bring that up, there's another comment here that I think is good to bring up. I think it shows a lot of openness and honesty. Being caregiver for years and helping people with these problems and saying the right things to help them. But when I tell myself the same things that I know that should help me, it doesn't help me. Like, do what I say, not as I do. So, I can relate to that. I think anybody in a caregiving position could probably relate to that. But any thoughts about that observation? Sometimes as caregivers, it's hard to take our own advice.
Yes, absolutely. We're known for it. We are healthcare workers, professionals, caregivers. We're known to put others first and to not give the same kind of compassion and care to ourselves. And it's been shown that if we can offer ourselves the same compassion and to not beat ourselves up over and over again over the same thing, or be so hard on ourselves where we'd otherwise be gentle with others, that it can help to relieve burnout. So that's a good observation, and I think it's a good one for caregivers in healthcare to think about that.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Olson. I think just the awareness of it is a step in the right direction to be able to say, yeah, this is not working. My advice is not working for me. So not be hard on ourselves, and then figure out what are the next best things for me to do to take care of myself. It may be a different answer or a different solution.
We sometimes think of healthcare as a calling, and we will pour ourselves into it, sometimes at the sacrifice to ourselves. But callings can have shadow sides too, and it's important to be aware of those shadow sides and to tend to yourself and care for yourself for the long run in service to your calling.
Yeah, for me, I wonder too, a lot of times in our best attempt to help others too, sometimes we say things that we don't realize may not help another person too. I at the bereavement center over 10 years, I listened to many people who lost children, who lost parents, who lost a loved one, and whoever they were, there was so many recurrent stories about lovely, well-intentioned people who came to say just the right thing to help them. And they didn't have the heart to tell them that it didn't help, that all those attempts to take the sorrow away couldn't work, because the person was really struggling and just needed to move through that difficult emotion. And particularly around childbirth, I heard some stories that were not helpful. People saying, well, you can have another child and things like that at the moment of the death, hoping to take the pain away, but actually causing hurt. And so I would say that we have to all watch out as caregivers, because we have a tendency to want to take pain away and to help people and to fix. And that's what maybe got us into this in the first place. But sometimes it absolutely isn't the right way to go. And when people are in the midst of hurt, and when we are in the midst of hurt, sometimes what we need to hear doesn't sound like a solution at all. It sounds more like empathy, like that really stinks, and I'm here with you. And so it's more about connection with other people than it is about a solution. And so I would say that I would encourage us all to notice the things that help, because sometimes the things that help are what help others. And sometimes we're different. Sometimes what we would have done for others doesn't help us, and that's okay, because we're different. And finding out those things, as Bud said, that help us are really important. But just remember that it's empathy, it's being with somebody that matters the most through loss, that matters the most through trauma, that help people be vulnerable and actually find growth many times in the midst of trauma.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes in settings like this too, you might not have the opportunity to really have the conversation you want to have. So, and nothing here is meant to be prescriptive. And that's why we also invite the wisdom of the community to share, because through that sharing, we find out we're not alone, and people have found different answers in different ways. And we got to tap into that. And part of that is also getting rid of the stigma of mental health care and what it's like to be a human, and to be able to be compassionate towards ourselves and one another, so that we have each other when we need each other.
Well, and here are a couple of good comments that segue from that. And I'll also ask the audience, if you have any other questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. I think we still have a few more minutes. But here's one: learning that it is so hard to pour from an empty cup. Give love to yourself. So that whole idea of really making sure we do put ourselves not first, but we're not. It's not being self-indulgent or selfish to fill up that cup for ourselves.
Yeah, we don't want to burn out. We want to go the distance of our life. Right.
Almost every religion in the world, and whether somebody's religious or not, has a love your neighbor as yourself kind of a maxim. And we're our closest neighbor, and not to forget our closest neighbor.
So here's another comment on the heels of that. I hope that in the future, the pandemic will unite the entire world.
And I guess that's up to us. If we want that to come true, we have to make it come true.
Yes. So folks in the audience, any other questions? And while if you want to chat, type that in. I thought of something. I mean, thinking about the question about having a cancer diagnosis or something, seriously, say maybe you've had COVID and you're, one of the long haulers, for example, it's still affecting you in some ways. That must be awfully hard to think about post-traumatic growth going through something like that. But does it make sense? And I'm going to ask you guys this question. If there's one area that it feels like we really can't grow from, I mean, we're feeling stuck in our body, for example, there's a problem with our body. Can we work on the emotional side, the spiritual side, the social support side? Are those ways that we can kind of balance the equation in a sense? Does that make sense to you? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. So in all those different domains of wellness, there are still
Right.
other aspects that may not be affected as much that we could strengthen to help support that part of us that feels weak at the time.
Correct.
I think that's makes sense to me. Have you used that, Bud, when people visit you at the EAP? Have you seen?
Well, we certainly try. I don't do any direct one-to-one counseling myself, but we do interact with a lot of folks within that setting that are going through all kinds of struggles. And I know, I mean, one of the things that and it's been touched on a couple of times that we found particularly helpful is to help people with that self-compassion side of it. And a couple of people have commented on that. Sometimes we're hardest on ourselves. And if we can learn that we're all in this together, we're all going through very similar struggles. We're not alone, but also to be kind to ourselves and make sure we do some things that really fill up whatever cups need filling.
Yeah. And we do
for our
know
own growth.
that as much of a net that you have, if you can strengthen all of those other different parts, and if you can create a meshwork of wellness, a meshwork of security, that definitely can bolster, stabilize, and help you to move through when there's a disturbance in something so profoundly in another part of your well-being.
Right. I like that way of thinking of it. Yeah.
I would say one of the most important things for me personally has been trying to find venues where I can truly be myself in all my humanity. So what that means is I'm not trying to put any kind of face on. I'm not trying to look good. I'm just myself. And if you can do that with people through the pandemic and just say, you know what, I'm exhausted, because I've been exhausted. Chaplains have been in the midst of it, as many caregivers have. People who are struggling with illness are in the midst of it, and you get exhausted. But it's okay to be human. It's okay to be exhausted. It's okay to not feel good. And to do that with other people is the key. And whether that's in a context like therapy or with a rabbi, a pastor, a friend, it almost matters more that you can be yourself than it matters the venue, though some venues are better than others in certain cases. So I would encourage you, if you're feeling exhausted, if you're struggling, to find those people who you can be yourself with, and you can be exhausted, and you can share all of that in all of its truth. And actually what I've found for myself, that when I do that, and when I feel that, or I weep about that, or whatever it is, I feel so much better, and I actually get strength, and I begin to reconnect with my calling and my sense of why I do this in the first place. Like, rather than just feeling exhausted, I start to feel like, you know what, I've just shared with somebody that this is really hard and why I do this. And I really feel invigorated now. And I can go at it again, and I can do it again. So my main point or hope for all of us would be to be real and to be with people through this. And that's the greatest potential to get through illness, to get through anything that we need to go through, and not to try to be strong, in the face of others, but to actually be real.
Yeah, I'm definitely grateful for those who have noticed in me and shared something of themselves, or just shared of themselves what they were going through. And then I was like, wow, that's right. That's exactly how I feel too. And it's such a profound thing when someone shares something with you and you're suddenly not alone, and you're suddenly validated, and you're suddenly, seen and heard and connected. So if anybody sees an opportunity to be that for someone, it's profound.
And getting connected to one's source of meaning, whatever that is. For some people that's more religious, but other people it could be art or nature or whatever. But whatever it is that brings a sense of purpose, meaning, and connectedness to you through these difficult experiences, those are very, very important. So if you're facing a new cancer diagnosis or a chronic illness or whatever it is, finding whatever that is larger than you, what you truly believe is critical, because you can't do it alone. And people are important. And also something larger than people is important, whatever that is for you.
I also see the opportunity here, while we have our audience here from our community, is this coming week, the March 4th through 11th, we're having a week where it's about being seen, heard, and valued. We call it Week of Gratitude, but it's going to be about listening to one another, being out there and seeing and hearing one another. And anybody can do that for the people around them. And it will really provide that kind of mesh work like you're talking about, Bud, that kind of network that keeps us feeling more secure and valued.
Yes, absolutely. Gratitude will definitely help us all. And I love that idea of it's not just the one level saying to the other level, thank you for what you do, but it's everybody. We have our coworkers, we have all the people that we interact with on a daily basis. So totally. Here's one last comment, and I'll give one last call if there's any last questions or comments. But this one is excellent. I totally agree that we need to practice and honor our humanness. I believe that when we all begin to be vulnerable with our humanity is the key to peace and heaven on earth.
Yes.
Well said.
So are there any other comments or questions from the audience? And I don't know, Chaplain Palladino and Dr. Olson, if you have any final wrap-up comments, but it doesn't look like there's anything right at the moment in the question and answer.
Well, I want to say it's great. I wish that I could have seen everybody, but I feel the humanness. I feel from the shares that have been given here that we came here as a community, we shared as a community. The wisdom is in the community, and the wisdom is in our humanness and all that we share together, because we've all had different experiences and are different places in our experiences and have something to offer one another. So I want to thank this community for being here and being human.
Yeah, and thank you. I really appreciate it as well. And I also feel the desire to just be with all of you, and I know that you're not, through Zoom, it's harder to do that. but I'm just so grateful that you've come. I would like to end, in 1994, Mother Teresa said something to me that I think really applies to what we experience as human beings. And I had been working with people with leprosy. And so when I explained to her my goals or my hopes, she said, there is a leprosy in the West, and I call it loneliness. She says, I want you to look around in Calcutta, where we were at the time, and we were looking down on off of a balcony. And she said, I want you to look at all those people in that particular area where there was a lot of poverty. And she says, point out the people who don't have a smile. And I was shocked. I looked down and people were laughing and smiling and were very poor. And she said, I have people coming from all over the world, and the richer country they come from and the more freedom they have, the more sometimes they're separated from others. And she said, the leprosy of the West is loneliness. And she said, we have sisters in Connecticut, and those sisters struggle more with people who are shut into their houses and have no love than people who can't be fed. And so my encouragement, based on what she said, is that we find that we can grow and thrive when we're not alone, and we're not trying to do it alone, and we're not trying to do it as autonomous, individuals that try to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. And that really is something that does not lead to growth, but actually growth comes when we seek out others who can hear us, and we're part of a community, and we can learn and grow and thrive. So my hope for all of us here, myself and everyone else, is that we not live in that kind of poverty, but actually live in the riches of not being alone and not being lonely, but being connected. And that's what I have to end with.
Chaplain Palladino, thank you very much for those closing words. Very touching. Dr. Olson, also thank you for your wonderful insights and your knowledge. Both of you did a fantastic job, and we all thank you very, very much. And we thank